Have you ever thought about helping to discover new galaxies from your couch? Or maybe tracking bird migrations from your backyard? This is the exciting world of citizen science, where literally anyone can contribute to real, hardcore research. It sounds like a total revolution in how we do science. But today, we're going to look at the data and ask, what's the reality behind that promise? Okay, let's dive in.
The vision is powerful. You see quotes like this from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency talking about an opportunity for everyone to get involved, to ask big questions, and to actually create change. It's science by the people, for the people. It's sold as this incredible movement that's going to democratize research and empower communities. And that's a really inspiring idea.
But this is where we need to press pause. When we say everyone, who are we really talking about? Is the person doing this work actually your average citizen? And is this thing really on a constant exponential rise like we hear about all the time? Well, we're about to put those popular ideas under the microscope.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at the big promises of citizen science. Then we'll get into the different ways people can actually participate. We're definitely going to tackle the myth of its growth, and then we'll dig into who these participants really are. After that, we'll uncover a really surprising inequality in how the work gets done, and finally, we'll talk about what all this means for the future.
All right, so let's start with the big idea. The one that gets all the headlines and gets policymakers really excited. This is the promise that citizen science is way more than just a hobby, that it's fundamentally changing the game of how research gets done.
The whole promise really boils down to a few key things. First, the idea that everyday people can make huge contributions to scientific research, gathering way more data than professional scientists ever could alone. Second, that it makes us all smarter about science just by doing it. And third, and this is the big one, that it democratizes science, making it more inclusive and a real alternative to the ivory tower of professional science. These are the claims we're going to test.
Now, before we go any further, you gotta understand that citizen science isn't just one thing. Not at all. It's actually a whole spectrum of activities. Researchers have broken it down into 5 different models, all based on how much say the public actually gets in the research.
So think of it like a ladder. At the very bottom, you have contractual projects. That's where a community might hire a scientist to study something, like local water quality. The most common type, though, is contributory. This is what most people think of. Scientists design the project, and the public helps collect data, like counting birds. Moving up the ladder, you get collaborative projects, where people help shape the questions. Then there's co-created, which is a true partnership between the public and experts from start to finish. And at the very top of the ladder is collegial science, where citizens are basically running their own research.
For the rest of this explainer, we're going to zoom in on where the action is, where we have the most data. And that's in those massive online projects, specifically the contributory ones. The ones where millions of people have signed up to classify galaxies or lend out their computer's processing power.
Okay, this brings us to our first major reality check. We're constantly told that citizen science is this new thing that's just exploding in popularity. But, well, the data tells a much, much more interesting story.
This is the headline you always see, right? The rise of the citizen scientist. It paints a picture of this smooth, continuous, exponential growth curve going straight up. But is that what's really happening? If you actually look at the signups for these big projects over the last 20+ years, the picture is, well, it's not that simple at all.
Check this out. It turns out there have been 2, really 3 totally distinct waves. The first, and actually the biggest wave, happened way back in 1999 with projects like SETI at Home. But get this, participation in those projects peaked in the year 2000 and has been going down ever since. A second, smaller wave kicked off around 2007 with projects like Galaxy Zoo. But all that exponential growth we hear about today, that's almost entirely driven by a third wave, sensing projects like iNaturalists, where people log photos of plants and animals. So it's not one continuous rise, it's a constantly shifting landscape.
Now, you will often see this number thrown around, over 14 million accounts created. And that sounds absolutely massive, right? It makes you picture this huge army of people actively doing science. But what does that number actually represent?
Well, here's the catch. When researchers looked at how many of those 14 million accounts were actually active in a given month, the number was closer to 760,000. That means less than 6% of all the accounts ever created were actually doing anything. So while the number of signups is huge, the number of people on the front lines is much, much smaller.
So we've got a better sense of the actual size of the crowd. But what about the people in that crowd? Does it really look like everyone?
Does it reflect the general public? Let's dig into the demographics.
And wow, this first chart is a shocker. In those massive early computing projects, the ones that for years were the biggest part of citizen science, the gender balance was incredibly skewed. We're talking over 90% male. Just think about that. The movement that was supposed to democratize science was, in its biggest form, even less diverse than professional science itself.
But that is not the whole story. Remember that new wave of growth in sensing projects? Well, here the picture is totally different. Projects like iNaturalist are nearly at gender parity. So while the past was really skewed, the current trend is actually moving toward a much more balanced community, which is a fantastic and important shift.
But here might be the most surprising finding of all. That idea of the ordinary citizen just stumbling into science, it might be mostly a myth. When you look at the people who list their jobs on these platforms, over 60% of them already work in science or IT. So, in many cases, it's less about the public discovering science and more about the scientific community finding new ways to work with each other.
Okay, so the active crowd is smaller and, in many cases, more expert than we thought. But even within that group of active people, there's another fascinating twist in the story. The way the work actually gets done is wildly unequal.
To measure this, scientists use a tool from economics called the Gini index. It's super simple. A score of 0 means perfect equality, everybody does the same amount of work. A score of 1 means perfect inequality, one person does everything. So what do you think these projects look like?
Just take a look at this. For the projects where people are analyzing things like galaxies, the inequality is just staggering. The top 10% of the most active users do almost 80% of all the work. That means the other 90% of people are doing the remaining 20%. It's not a democracy of effort. It's what they call a power law, just like on YouTube, where a tiny number of creators get almost all the views.
And even in those newer, more gender-balanced sensing projects, the same basic rule applies. It's a little more equal, sure, but you still have the top 10% of contributors providing nearly 70% of the data. So that image of a huge distributed army of equals just doesn't hold up. In reality, it's more like a small group of super dedicated power users doing the heavy lifting for everyone else.
So after going through all this data, what's the big takeaway? Let's put everything together and see how the promise of citizen science stacks up against the reality we've uncovered. So on one side, you've got the simple, popular story. A single, booming movement of everyday people, all chipping in equally to democratize science. But on the other side, the data shows a reality that's way more complex and, frankly, a lot more interesting. Instead of one boom, it's a shifting landscape of different waves. Instead of being fully democratic, it's often powered by people who are already experts. And instead of equal work, it's driven by a tiny fraction of super users.
Now, none of this is to say that citizen science has failed. Absolutely not. The potential is still enormous. But to unlock that potential, we have to be honest about the reality. We have to move past the simple myths. And that leaves us with the most important question of all. If we really want to build a public science that is for everyone, what do we have to do differently? Where do we go from here?